In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
In the summer of 2016, there was a remarkable news story about something precious that was lost for 35 years and then found again. It was a Stradivarius violin, nearly 300 years old, crafted by that most renowned of violin makers. It belonged to Rowan Totenberg, one of the world's greatest concert violinists. Totenberg was a Polish Jew who had fled to America on the eve of World War II at the height of his career. You may recognize his family name if you listen to NPR. His daughter Nina Totenberg is their longtime legal correspondent. Mr. Totenberg's Stradivarius was stolen in 1980 after a concert he gave at the Boston Music School where he taught. The instrument was never seen again until 2015. A California woman contacted a violin appraiser asking him about an old instrument her husband had given her just before his death in 2011. She put it away for a few years because she couldn't open the case's combination lock. But finally, curiosity got the best of her, and she broke the lock. And when she opened the case, she realized that she had an antique instrument. The appraiser recognized it immediately. He alerted the authorities, who contacted the FBI. The woman insisted her husband never told her the violin had been stolen. She surrendered the instrument and law enforcement did not press charges. The woman's late husband was a lesser-known violinist by the name of Philip Johnson. He'd been hanging around backstage on the night of the crime, and Mr. Totenberg had suspected that Johnson was the thief, but could never prove it. The instrument is worth millions, but to Mr. Totenberg, it had no price. He told his daughters after the crime, "It's sort of like having your arm taken from you." It is a shame that Johnson's wife didn't take it to the appraiser earlier, at the time of her husband's death. If she had, Mr. Totenberg, who died in 2012 at the age of 101, might have played his prized Stradivarius one last time. The Totenberg daughters decided at the time the Stradivarius was returned to them not to sell it to a mere collector. As Nina put it in an interview on NPR, great violins are meant to be played by great artists. It will eventually be in the hands of another great artist, she said, like my father. And the beautiful, brilliant, and throaty voice of that violin, long stilled, will once again thrill audiences in concert halls around the world. The parable of Jesus, known as the Pearl of Great Price, is one of his shorter ones and is included with some other short parables in today's gospel reading. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it." In many ways, though, this parable may be misnamed because that pearl, like Totenberg's Stradivarius, had no price. This is a curious parable, given the fact that the only character in the parable is the merchant. And as such, he was likely a dealer in luxury items. He buys and sells fine jewelry, including pearls, which in biblical times were the most costly and sought-after baubles of all. And to deal in pearls, a merchant had to be a person of extreme wealth. He's used to laying out hundreds, if not thousands of denarii, hoping to earn back that and more when he resells his tiny treasures to the nobility of the time. To a merchant like him, it's all about the money. That is, until one day, the day he comes upon the most perfect and beautiful pearl he has ever seen. And Jesus tells us what he does in response. He went and sold all that he had and bought it. Now, one might think he went to such lengths because he felt confident he could turn a profit, sell this exquisite pearl for even more. And if that were true, his purchase was really a calculated risk, a shrewd business decision. But notice that Jesus does not tell us that. The story is about his purchase of the pearl and no more. The parable leaves us hanging. Did the merchant go on to resell it? If so, how much did he profit? We'll never know. But Jesus isn't interested in how much the merchant might have earned, because the parable is about the buying and not the selling. And the most amazing aspect of the story is this: the merchant sold all that he had to buy it. And that means the merchant didn't just open up his piggy bank. He didn't hit his friends up for a little bridge loan financing. He didn't go down to the bank or take out a home equity line of credit. No, the parable says he sold everything. This means his houses, his lands, his clothing, his business, all of his other possessions. That is what everything means. In his quest for that great pearl, he was all in, totally exposed, no room for a plan B or any shrewdness. And this is truly radical. But it was the only way to obtain the pearl. He was willing to pay such an extraordinary price because that tiny, iridescent sphere exerted a magnetic attraction on his very spirit. I recently participated in the Episcopal Church's National Preaching Excellence Conference, where Amy Jill Levine, the insightful Jewish commentator on the New Testament, told us that for the merchant to pay such a jaw-dropping price means he is fundamentally changed by the transaction. Because if he sells off his entire pearl buying business, including his stock in trade, commits every bit of his working capital, this means he's no longer what he was. He is no longer a merchant. He ceased to be a buyer and a seller. He's become just a buyer, but more fundamentally different, he has become the owner of something. So captivated is the man by this flawless jewel that he is willing to remake his entire life in order to possess it. And if we think about that for just a moment, if we imagine and reflect on our own lives, has there ever been anything as radical, transformative, and consuming in our lives as the pearl was in the parable? The traditional allegorical interpretation of this parable is that the pearl represents the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. It's the fundamental message of Christian salvation. There's no more important thing to do in life than hold that pearl in our hands. No sacrifice is too great, if by making it we gain the ultimate reward, the beatific vision of God in Christ for all time. And there's something appealing about this allegorical interpretation. It's simple, it's cut and dry. Once someone gives you the key and you know which of the story's details stand for what, you can take that knowledge to the bank, if you will, right? But that's not right. There's scant evidence in the Bible that Jesus meant any of his parables as allegories. Sure, there are a few times where the gospel writers supply us with a kind of allegorical key for the characters and objects in the parable. But these cases are really few and far between. And a great many scholars of the New Testament have concluded that those after-the-fact interpretations owe more to the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John than they do to Jesus himself. And if there's one thing that the gospel writers do say again and again about the parables of Jesus, it's that they're hard to understand. They were hard for that first generation of disciples, and they're even harder for us today. Their meanings not always obvious. The plot lines take unexpected turns. Sometimes thoroughly disreputable characters end up being the ones who are telling the gospel truth, and conventionally religious people end up sounding like fools. I want to suggest that the purpose of the parables more often than not is to set us off balance, to pull us out of our theological comfort zone, to shake up the ways we typically think about things. And in this parable, Jesus never claims that the pearl symbolizes heaven. What he actually said was the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. So if I was to strictly follow this sort of allegorical method, I'd have to say that the kingdom of heaven is the merchant, not the pearl. And that doesn't really make any sense at all, does it? What Jesus might be saying is closer to this. If you want to sense the nearness of the kingdom of heaven, which is already breaking into this world, you've got to do what the merchant did. We can't just sit at home doing business as usual. You and I are called to get up and go into the world and search the kingdom out. Examine every pearl that we come across. Note well its beauty and its symmetry, its shining, iridescent quality. And the more you come to see and find and experience the good things that God has created, the more ready you will be to discover that one pearl. The perfect pearl that has no price. Such a pearl demands everything that you have, everything that I am, and we will cheerfully give it all up, everything else, just to have it. There's a story about the Christian activist Dorothy Day that the parable of the pearl of great price reminds me of. A wealthy woman came to the Catholic day worker house one day, and Dorothy gave her the grand tour of the place. The visitor was mighty impressed at the good work being done there. And at the end of the tour, she took out her checkbook and made out a very generous check. After her donations, she started to walk out, but then abruptly stopped and turned around. And on seeming impulse, pulled a diamond ring off her finger and gave it to Dorothy. Now, one of Dorothy's associates saw the size of that shimmering rock and thought, this is a wonderful thing. Because the organization was chronically short of money. And she knew that that ring could be sold for a tidy sum. So we might imagine her astonishment when later in the day, she spied that very diamond ring sparkling on the finger of a woman from the neighborhood who had come into the Catholic worker house for help. The staffer ran up to Dorothy and asked her how that client had got a hold of that diamond ring. Well, I gave it to her, said Dorothy rather matter-of-factly. What were you thinking? Asked the staff member. Don't you know if we sold that ring, we could pay that woman's rent for a year? And Dorothy just looked at her for a moment. And then she said, as far as she was concerned, the woman could do whatever she wanted with the ring. She could sell it for rent money. She could take a trip to the Bahamas. Or she could simply enjoy wearing a diamond ring on her finger. Do you suppose, Dorothy asked the worker, that God created diamonds only for rich people? Now, in that story, Dorothy's decision seems to defy common sense, doesn't it? By any worldly standard, the staffer was absolutely right. The sensible thing to do was to sell that ring and record the proceeds back on the black ink side of the balance sheet of the Catholic workers' house. But people that develop a deep spiritual sensitivity, like Dorothy Day, don't always see things the way the rest of us are tempted to do. Once you've glimpsed the pearl that has no price, once you've seen it shimmering before your eyes, it's hard to assess anything else in God's creation according to a cold calculus of only dollars and cents. I think that's what a good parable does for us. It opens our eyes to a spiritual truth that we might not see otherwise. With such a vision, though, a diamond ring on the finger of a welfare recipient is the most natural thing in the world. And a Stradivarius deserves to be sold not to the highest bidder, but to someone who can make it sing. And Jesus uses the parable of the pearl to remind us that there are some things in life so precious that other wishes and requests pale in comparison. And with this in mind, some questions seem to naturally arise. What is it that I am searching for, or I often wish for? Are there any blessings in your life that you might be taking for granted? In what way do we have our priorities organized? Are the most important things in life getting my time, my effort, my attention? Where is our discipleship in our priorities? I would encourage us to use some of our prayers this week to reflect on the parable of the pearl of great price, and these kinds of questions that it may draw forth from us. Sit quietly and ask God to help us see the things that are of true importance, and ask him to show us what we can do as his disciples to manifest his kingdom more fully to those in our own lives and those who might need us most.